They saw her sitting alone in the corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. No uniform, no medals, no fanfare, just a woman in worn jeans and a faded hoodie who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The recruits at the neighboring table started whispering, making jokes about the civilian who'd somehow wandered into their favorite military hangout. One of them even had the audacity to suggest she was probably waiting for her boyfriend to finish his shift. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But then the lights dimmed for the evening briefing, and when she stood to leave, her sleeve caught on the chair. For just a moment, a small patch became visible on her jacket, dark fabric with silver threading that most people wouldn't recognize. The room went dead silent when Sergeant Major Torres walked in, spotted that patch, and immediately snapped to attention. Want to know what that patch meant and why a 20-year veteran showed more respect in that moment than he'd shown to any commanding officer? The neon sign outside Murphy's Tavern flickered against the October rain, casting intermittent red shadows across the wet asphalt of Fort Braxton's main strip. Inside, the familiar sounds of military life after hours filled the air, the clink of beer bottles, the low murmur of conversations about deployments and transfers, the occasional burst of laughter from soldiers trying to forget whatever they'd left behind on the training grounds. Chen sat in the back corner booth, the same spot she'd occupied for the past 3 Thursday evenings. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she kept her hands wrapped around the ceramic mug anyway, using it as an anchor in a room full of memories she wasn't sure she wanted to revisit. The hoodie she wore was army surplus, bought from a thrift store in town, faded green with a zipper that caught halfway up. Her jeans were worn soft at the knees, and her boots civilian hiking boots. Not military issues showed the kind of wear that came from actual use, not parade ground polish. She'd chosen this place precisely because it was unremarkable. Murphy's wasn't the kind of establishment that attracted officers or career military looking to network. It was where junior enlisted soldiers came to decompress, where conversations stayed casual and nobody asked too many questions about your service record. The owner, a retired Navy cook named Murphy, original name, she'd thought when she first walked in, served decent burgers and minded his own business. Perfect for someone who needed to be around military culture without being part of it. At the table across the narrow aisle, 4 soldiers in ACS sat hunched over their phones, occasionally glancing up to comment on whatever training exercise had dominated their day. Sarah had been listening to their conversation without meaning. 2. The way you involuntarily tune into familiar frequencies. They were fresh out of basic training, maybe 6 months into their first duty assignment, still carrying that mixture of pride and uncertainty that marked soldiers who hadn't yet figured out what kind of military career they wanted to build. The youngest of the group, a private whose name tape read Williams, kept stealing glances at Sarah between swipes on his phone screen. She'd noticed him looking over several times, and each time he'd quickly turn back to his friends with the embarrassed expression of someone who'd been caught staring. Finally, he leaned forward and whispered something to his companions that made them all turn to look at her. Sarah kept her eyes on her coffee, but her peripheral vision caught the exchange. She'd become skilled at reading body language from across rooms, at picking up conversations that weren't meant for her ears. It was a habit that had kept her alive in places where the wrong kind of attention could be fatal, and it was proving useful now for different reasons. I'm telling you, she doesn't belong here, Williams was saying, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. Look at her clothes, look at how she's sitting. She's not military. The soldier next to him, a specialist named Rodriguez, according to his uniform, shook his head. So what? It's not like this place is members only. Maybe she's waiting for someone. Or maybe she's one of those military groupies, suggested a third soldier, whose name Sarah couldn't see from her angle. You know, the ones who hang around bases looking for soldiers to date. Williams laughed, but it wasn't a particularly kind sound. In that outfit, she looks like she shops at Goodwill. Sarah's grip tightened slightly on her mug. She'd been called worse things by better people, but something about the casual dismissal in the young soldier's voice reminded her of other conversations, other assumptions that had been made about her appearance and her place in military spaces. She'd learned long ago not to let such comments affect her, but the familiarity of it still stung. The fourth member of their group, a corporal whose stripes indicated he had slightly more experience than the others, seemed less interested in speculating about Sarah's presence. He was older, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of weathered look that suggested he'd seen more than his rank might indicate. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of caution that the others missed. "Maybe we should just mind our own business," he said quietly. But Williams was warming to his theme now, emboldened by what he perceived as his friend's agreement. "I mean, seriously, what's she doing here? This isn't Starbucks. If you're not military, you don't just hang out at places like this." Sarah finally looked up from her coffee, not at Williams but at the corporal who'd suggested they drop the subject. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she saw something there that the others lacked, a recognition that situations weren't always what they appeared to be, that assumptions could be dangerous. He gave her a small nod, almost apologetic, before turning back to his companions. "Come on, guys," he said, his voice firmer now. "Let's talk about something else." But Williams was past the point of taking subtle hints. He was young enough to mistake his uniform for authority, and inexperienced enough to think that wearing it gave him the right to police who belonged in his world. Sarah watched him stand up, saw the moment when he decided to act on his assumptions rather than simply voice them. He walked over to her table with the swagger of someone who'd never been truly challenged, never had his worldview tested by anything more serious than a difficult training exercise. His friends followed reluctantly, the corporal bringing up the rear with obvious reluctance. "Excuse me, ma'am," Williams said, the politeness in his voice clearly artificial. "I was wondering if you might be lost. This is kind of a military hangout, you know." Sarah looked up at him without moving her hands from her coffee mug. Her expression was neutral, giving nothing away. "I'm not lost," she said simply. "Well, it's just that you don't really look like you belong here," Williams continued, apparently interpreting her calm response as an invitation to elaborate. "I mean, no offense, but this place is usually just for service members and their families." "And which category do you think I fall into?" Sarah asked, her voice still level. Williams glanced back at his friends, seeking support, or maybe just an audience. "Well, I mean, you're obviously not active duty. And you don't really look like a military wife, if you don't mind me saying." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was measuring the young soldier in front of her, trying to determine whether his behavior came from genuine confusion about her presence, or simply from the kind of territorial instinct that sometimes infected junior enlisted soldiers who felt the need to prove their belonging by excluding others. "What makes you think I'm not military?" she asked finally. This seemed to surprise Williams. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." He gestured vaguely at her civilian clothes, her relaxed posture, the absence of any obvious military bearing. "I mean, look at you. You're not exactly projecting military presence." The corporal behind him shifted uncomfortably. "Williams, maybe we should just—" "No, it's okay," Sarah interrupted, still looking at Williams. "I'm curious about his reasoning." Williams straightened up, apparently taking her interest as validation. "Well, for starters, your posture. Military personnel sit differently, even when they're off duty. You're all slouched over like you're at home watching TV." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "What else?" "Your clothes," Williams continued, gaining confidence. I mean, even when we're in civvies, there's usually something, a unit t-shirt, a cap, something that shows our service. You look like you bought everything at a thrift store. Maybe I did, Sarah said. And your hands, Williams added, apparently out of roll now. Military hands are different. They're harder, more calloused. Yours look like you've never done a day of manual labor in your life. Sarah looked down at her hands, still wrapped around her coffee mug. They were indeed softer than they'd once been, the calluses from years of rope work and weapons handling having faded during her time away from active duty. It was an observation that showed Williams was more perceptive than she'd given him credit for, even if his conclusions were wrong. So what do you think I do for a living? She asked. Williams shrugged. I don't know, office work? Maybe you're a teacher or something. The point is, you're not military, and this place is really meant for people who are. The corporal stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Look, ma'am, I'm sorry about this. My friend here is just concerned about maintaining military culture, Sarah finished for him. I understand. She stood up slowly, and Williams took a step back, perhaps suddenly aware that the conversation had taken on a different tone. Sarah was taller than she'd appeared sitting down, and when she moved, there was something in her posture that contradicted everything Williams had just said about military bearing. You know what? She said, reaching into her jacket pocket. Maybe I should prove I belong here. She pulled out a wallet, worn leather that had seen better days, and extracted what looked like a military ID card. But instead of handing it to Williams, she held it so that only she could see it, studying it as if she hadn't looked at it in a long time. The thing is, she continued, still looking at the card, I'm not sure I want to. This seemed to confuse Williams. What do you mean? Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time since the conversation began, something shifted in her expression. The neutral calm remained, but underneath it, Williams caught a glimpse of something harder, something that made him instinctively straighten his shoulders. I mean that belonging somewhere isn't just about having the right credentials, she said. It's about understanding what those credentials represent. And sometimes, the people who are quickest to question other people's belonging are the ones who understand it least. She slipped the ID card back into her wallet without showing it to anyone. But you're right about one thing. I'm not active duty anymore. Williams looked confused. So you were military? For a while, Sarah said. What branch? Rodriguez asked, speaking for the first time since they'd approached her table. Army, Sarah replied. What was your MOS? The corporal asked, using the military term for job specialty. Sarah hesitated for a moment, and Williams jumped into the silence. See, she doesn't even know what MOS means. 11 Bravo, Sarah said quietly. The effect was immediate. All 4 soldiers straightened up, their casual dismissal replaced by something approaching attention. 11 Bravo was infantry, the tip of the spear, the soldiers who did the actual fighting when politicians ran out of other options. You were infantry? Rodriguez asked, disbelief clear in his voice. For a while, Sarah repeated. Williams was still skeptical. Women weren't allowed in infantry units until recently. How long ago did you serve? Long enough, Sarah said. The corporal was studying her more carefully now, his earlier caution replaced by genuine curiosity. What unit? Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing her response. Different units, different times. That's not really an answer, Williams said. No, Sarah agreed. It's not. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the tavern's front door opening with more force than necessary. The sudden influx of cold air and the heavy footsteps that followed made everyone in the bar look up from their drinks and conversations. Sergeant Major Torres entered like a force of nature, his presence immediately commanding attention from every soldier in the room. Even in civilian clothes, there was no mistaking his rank or his authority. He was a career soldier in his early 50s, with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of making difficult decisions under pressure. His eyes swept the room with the automatic assessment of someone who'd walked into countless unfamiliar spaces and needed to quickly understand their dynamics. Torres had been Sergeant Major at Fort Braxton for 3 years, long enough to know most of the junior enlisted soldiers by sight and reputation he'd heard about. Murphy's Tavern from his subordinates, knew it was where they went to decompress, but he'd never actually visited the place himself. Tonight was different. Tonight he'd received a phone call that had changed everything. His gaze moved methodically across the room, taking in the familiar faces of soldiers he'd trained and disciplined and occasionally commended. When his eyes reached the back corner booth, where Sarah stood surrounded by the 4 junior soldiers, he stopped walking. For a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, recognition dawned across his features, followed immediately by something that looked like shock. The room had gone quiet, the way military spaces always did when senior leadership appeared unexpectedly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and even the soldiers who'd been drinking beer stood a little straighter. Torres walked slowly toward Sarah's table, his eyes never leaving her face. When he was about 10 feet away, he stopped and studied her more carefully, as if confirming something he couldn't quite believe. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that made everyone in the room pay attention. "I received a call from Colonel Martinez. He said you might be here." Sarah nodded slightly. "Sergeant Major. He said you'd been asking about memorial services for Sergeant Patterson." "I was." Torres glanced at the 4 soldiers still standing around her table, then back at Sarah. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation privately?" "These soldiers were just leaving," Sarah said, looking at Williams and his companions. But Williams, apparently still not reading the room correctly, decided to interject. "Actually, we were just trying to figure out if she really belongs here. She claims she was infantry, but—" "Soldier," Torres said, his voice cutting through Williams' explanation like a blade. "What's your name?" "Private Williams, Sergeant Major." "Private Williams, I suggest you return to your table immediately." "But Sergeant Major, we were just—" "Now, soldier." Williams looked confused, but began to move away from Sarah's table. His friends followed, except for the corporal, who lingered for a moment longer, studying the interaction between Torres and Sarah with obvious interest. Torres waited until the soldiers were out of earshot before speaking again. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. If I'd known you were here, I would have ensured you were treated with appropriate respect." Sarah shook her head. "No apology necessary, Sergeant Major. They were just being soldiers." "Young soldiers," Torres corrected. "Old enough to know better." He gestured toward her table. "May I sit?" Sarah nodded, and they both settled into the booth. Torres studied her across the scarred wooden table, his expression mixing respect with curiosity. "Colonel Martinez said you were asking about Danny Patterson's memorial service," he said quietly. "I was. I heard about what happened to him." Torres nodded grimly. "IED outside Kandahar, 3rd deployment. He was a good soldier, good man. Had a family back home." "I know," Sarah said. "I served with him once." "When?" Sarah hesitated. "A long time ago. Different unit, different mission." Torres leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive me if I'm overstepping. But Colonel Martinez seemed to think you might be someone I should know about. I don't know what he told you. He said you'd been asking very specific questions about Patterson's service record. Questions that suggested you knew more about his background than most people would." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was looking past Torres, toward the bar where Murphy was wiping down glasses with the methodical precision of someone who'd been doing the same job for years. "He also said," Torres continued, "that when he asked you about your own service record, You deflected the question in a way that suggested you had something to hide. Maybe I just value my privacy, Sarah said. Maybe, Torres agreed. Or maybe you have reasons for keeping your service record private that go beyond personal preference. Sarah looked back at him, and Torres saw something in her eyes that confirmed his suspicions. It was the look of someone who'd seen things that weren't discussed in official reports, who'd done things that didn't appear in personnel files. Sergeant Major, she said finally, what would you do if I told you that Danny Patterson saved my life once? Torres considered the question carefully. I'd ask you to tell me about it. And if I told you that the circumstances of how he saved my life were classified above your clearance level? Then I'd ask you what clearance level would be required. Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine expression Torres had seen from her. Higher than yours. Torres leaned back in his seat, processing the implications of what she'd just said. In his 28 years of military service, he'd encountered classified operations before, but most of them involved logistics or intelligence work that was sensitive but not necessarily dangerous. The kind of classification Sarah was hinting at suggested something else entirely. Ma'am, he said slowly, are you telling me that you and Patterson served together in a classified unit? I'm telling you that Danny Patterson was a good soldier who died too young, and that I wanted to pay my respects. It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. But Torres had been in the military long enough to recognize when certain questions shouldn't be pressed further, at least not in a public setting. The memorial service is tomorrow at 1400 hours, he said. Base Chapel. You're welcome to attend. Thank you. Torres stood up, then paused. Ma'am, I don't know what your service record looks like, and I'm not going to ask. But I will say this, if you served with Danny Patterson in the capacity I think you might have then, you have my respect and my gratitude. Sarah nodded but didn't respond. Torres started to walk away, then stopped and looked back at her. Those soldiers who were bothering you earlier, he said. They're good kids, but they're still learning. Sometimes the most important lessons come from realizing how much you don't know. After Torres left, Sarah sat alone in the booth for several more minutes, finishing her cold coffee and thinking about conversations that had ended badly and assumptions that had proven costly. Across the room, she could see Williams and his friends huddled together, clearly discussing what they'd just witnessed. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the confusion on their faces as they tried to reconcile their initial assessment of her with the respect Torres had shown. Finally, she stood up and walked to the bar to pay for her coffee. Murphy looked up from the glass he was cleaning and studied her with the practiced eye of someone who'd served drinks to soldiers for decades. Everything okay over there? He asked, nodding toward the corner booth. I saw Torres come in. He doesn't usually visit my establishment. Everything's fine, Sarah said, placing a $10 bill on the bar. Murphy made change from the register, then leaned forward slightly. You know, I've been running this place for 15 years. I've seen a lot of soldiers come and go, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people. Sarah waited for him to continue. Those kids who were bothering you, Murphy said, they're not bad soldiers. They're just young and stupid, which is redundant when you're talking about 20-year-old infantrymen. I wasn't bothered, Sarah said. Murphy smiled. No, I don't suppose you were. But they were bothering me. I don't like it when customers get hassled for no good reason. He handed her the change, but when she reached for it, he didn't immediately let go. The thing is, in my experience, the people who look like they don't belong are often the ones who belong most of all. Sarah looked at him more carefully. What makes you say that? Because the people who really belong somewhere don't need to prove it to anyone. They just are. Sarah pocketed the change and headed toward the door. Behind her, she could hear Murphy calling out to the 4 soldiers at their table. Williams, Rodriguez, all of you. Come here. She paused at the door, curious about what Murphy was going to say to them, but decided it wasn't her business. Whatever lesson they were about to learn, they'd have to learn it themselves. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the parking lot into a maze of puddles that reflected the neon lights from the bar's windows. Sarah pulled her hood up and walked to her car, an older Honda Civic that had seen better days but still ran reliably. As she fumbled with her keys, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see the corporal from Williams' group jogging across the parking lot. "Ma'am," he called out, slowing to a walk as he approached her car. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to apologize for my friends." Sarah looked at him, noting the genuine concern in his expression. "What's your name, soldier?" "Corporal." "Jackson, ma'am. Look, I know Williams was out of line, and I should have shut him down sooner. It's just what?" Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "It's just that we're all pretty new here, and sometimes guys like Williams feel like they need to prove they belong by making sure other people don't. It's stupid, and it's wrong, but it's also kind of understandable when you're 20 years old and scared you're going to screw up." Sarah considered this. "What about you, Corporal? Are you scared you're going to screw up?" "Every day," Jackson admitted, "but I try to handle it by paying attention instead of running my mouth. That's probably wise." Jackson nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "When Sergeant Major Torres came in tonight, the way he looked at you, I've never seen him show that kind of respect to anyone, except maybe the colonel. And Torres has been in the army longer than I've been alive." Sarah didn't respond, but Jackson continued anyway. "The thing is, I've been paying attention like I said, and I've noticed things about you that Williams missed. The way you sit, the way you watch the room, the way you positioned yourself at that table so you could see both entrances. That's not civilian behavior." "Maybe I'm just paranoid," Sarah said. "Maybe," Jackson agreed. "Or maybe you're someone who's had to worry about threats coming from directions that civilians don't think about." Sarah studied the young corporal's face in the dim light from the bar's windows. "What's your point, soldier?" "My point is that I think Williams was wrong about you not belonging here. I think maybe you belong here more than any of us do." Sarah unlocked her car door but didn't immediately get in. "Corporal Jackson, let me give you some advice. In this business, the people who talk the most about belonging are usually the ones who understand it least. And the people who understand it most are usually the ones who talk about it least." She opened her car door, then paused. "Your friend Williams isn't a bad soldier. He's just young and trying to figure out his place in the world. But if he keeps making assumptions about people based on their appearance, he's going to find himself in situations where those assumptions could get him killed." "I'll talk to him," Jackson said. "Good, and Corporal?" "Yes, ma'am?" "The next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong somewhere, consider the possibility that they might belong there more than you do." Sarah got in her car and started the engine. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she could see Jackson still standing where she'd left him, apparently thinking about what she'd said. The drive back to her apartment took 15 minutes through the quiet streets of the small town that had grown up around Fort Braxton. Sarah lived in a modest complex about 2 miles from the base, close enough to hear the sounds of training exercises but far enough away to feel disconnected from the daily rhythm of military life. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor, a 1-bedroom unit that she'd furnished with the bare minimum necessary for comfortable living. The walls were mostly bare except for a few photographs, landscapes, mostly pictures she'd taken during her travels after leaving the military. There were no military memorabilia, no photographs of her in uniform, no visible reminders of her service record. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, thinking about the conversation at Murphy's and the memorial service she'd be attending tomorrow. Danny Patterson had been a good soldier and, more importantly, a good man. He deserved better than an IED on a routine patrol during his 3rd deployment. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her wallet, extracting the military ID card she'd shown briefly to Williams and his friends. It was her retired ID card, standard issue for veterans, with her photograph and basic information. Nothing classified, nothing that would have raised questions. But there was something else in her wallet that she hadn't shown them, something that would have changed the entire conversation. A small piece of fabric, carefully folded and tucked behind her driver's license. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a unit patch that most people would never recognize. It was black fabric with silver threading, depicting a stylized eagle with its wings spread wide. Beneath the eagle were crossed arrows, and beneath those, a single word in small letters: shadow. Sarah stared at the patch for a long moment, remembering the weight of wearing it, the responsibility it had represented, the missions it had authorized her to undertake. She'd earned the right to wear it through months of training that had pushed her beyond what she'd thought possible, and she'd honored it through years of operations that had never appeared in official records. The Shadow Regiment had been disbanded 5 years ago, officially because budget constraints required consolidation of special operations units. Unofficially, because too many of their operations had become politically inconvenient, and it was easier to eliminate the unit than to answer questions about what they'd been doing. Sarah folded the patch carefully and put it back in her wallet. Tomorrow she would attend Danny Patterson's memorial service and remember a good soldier who'd died doing his job. Tonight, she would try to forget the conversation at Murphy's and the reminder that even in civilian clothes, in a bar full of people who should have understood military service, she was still an outsider. But as she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about Corporal Jackson and his observation about the way she watched the room. He'd been right, of course. Old habits died hard, and the training that had kept her alive in hostile territory wasn't something you could simply turn off when you returned to civilian life. The truth was, she'd been watching the room not because she felt threatened, but because she felt responsible. It was an instinct that had been drilled into her during years of operations, where her job had been to identify threats before they became problems, to protect assets who didn't even know they needed protecting. Even now, even in a bar full of young soldiers who saw her as an outsider, she'd been unconsciously cataloging exits, noting potential weapons, assessing who in the room might be capable of handling themselves in a crisis. It was exhausting, but it was also automatic. Sarah turned off the lights and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, she lay in the dark thinking about patches and call signs, about assumptions and belonging, about the price of serving in units that didn't exist and carrying out missions that couldn't be acknowledged. Tomorrow, she would pay her respects to Danny Patterson and try to find some closure for a chapter of her life that had ended abruptly and without ceremony. But tonight, she would remember why she'd chosen to serve in the shadows and why she'd chosen to leave them behind. The chapel at Fort Braxton stood like a fortress of solitude against the gray morning sky, its red brick walls weathered by decades of rain and wind, but still solid, still offering sanctuary to those who needed it. Sarah arrived 20 minutes early, parking her Honda in the visitor section and walking slowly toward the entrance. She'd chosen to wear black slacks and a dark blazer, civilian clothes that wouldn't draw attention, but still showed respect for the occasion. The morning air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the rhythmic cadence of soldiers running formation. It was a sound that had once been as familiar as her own heartbeat, a reminder of routine and purpose that she'd lost when she'd left the service. Now it felt foreign, like overhearing a conversation in a language she'd once spoken fluently, but had slowly forgotten. Inside the chapel, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a small altar where Danny Patterson's photograph sat surrounded by flowers and an American flag. The picture showed him in dress uniform, young and serious, with the kind of expression that suggested he'd understood the weight of the oath he'd taken. Sarah recognized the photo from his personnel file, though she'd never seen him look quite so formal in person. She chose a seat in the back row, positioning herself where she could see both the entrance and the side exits. Old habits died hard. And even in a place as safe as a military chapel, she found herself automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes. It was a reflex that had kept her alive during operations in places where the line between sanctuary and trap could shift without warning. The chapel began to fill slowly as other mourners arrived. Most were soldiers in dress uniform, their ribbons and badges telling stories of deployments in training and sacrifice. Some were older, career military with the weathered faces of men, and women who'd seen too much but stayed because someone had to. Others were younger, probably soldiers who'd served with Patterson during his final deployment, carrying the particular grief of those who'd lost a friend to an enemy they couldn't fight back against. Sarah recognized a few faces from the previous evening at Murphy's Tavern. Corporal Jackson entered with 3 other soldiers, all of them moving with the careful precision of men trying to honor a fallen comrade while managing their own emotions. She didn't see Private Williams among them and wondered if he'd chosen not to attend or if he'd been assigned to duty elsewhere. Near the front of the chapel, a woman in her 30s sat holding the hand of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. This would be Patterson's widow and son, Sarah realized, the family he'd left behind when that IED had torn through his vehicle on a road outside Kandahar. The woman's face was composed but fragile, like someone who'd used up all her tears and was now running on determination alone. Sergeant Major Torres entered just as the service was about to begin, scanning the room with the automatic assessment of a leader taking accountability of his people. When his eyes found Sarah in the back row, he nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that somehow managed to convey both respect and curiosity. The chaplain was a lieutenant colonel with gray hair and gentle eyes who'd clearly presided over too many services like this one. He spoke about service and sacrifice, about soldiers who'd answered the call to defend freedom even when the cost was everything they had to give. His words were familiar, the same themes that echoed through every military funeral, but they carried weight because they were true. When the chaplain finished his remarks, he invited others to share memories of Danny Patterson. Several soldiers stood to speak, telling stories about his sense of humor, his dedication to his men, his love for his family. They painted a picture of a man who'd been ordinary in all the best ways, someone who'd done his job with quiet competence, and treated everyone around him with respect. Sarah listened to each speaker, learning about aspects of Patterson's life that she'd never known. The Danny Patterson she'd served with had been focused and professional, but she'd seen only one side of him during their brief time together. These stories revealed a fuller picture of a man who'd been a husband and father, a friend and mentor, someone whose loss created ripples that would be felt for years to come. As the sharing of memories wound down, the chaplain asked if anyone else would like to speak. The chapel fell quiet, and Sarah felt the weight of all the things she couldn't say, all the stories about Danny Patterson that would never be told because they were classified above the clearance level of everyone in the room. She thought about the night in Somalia when Patterson had carried a wounded teammate 3 kilometers through hostile territory, moving through darkness with nothing but a compass and his training to guide him. She remembered his calm voice on the radio during a firefight that had lasted 14 hours, calling in coordinates and casualty reports with the same steady professionalism he'd shown during routine training exercises. Most of all, she remembered the moment when their helicopter had taken fire during an extraction mission, when Patterson had stayed behind to provide covering fire while the rest of the team evacuated. He'd made it out that night, but barely, and the scar on his left shoulder had been a permanent reminder of how close they'd all come to losing him. These were the stories that mattered, the ones that showed who Danny Patterson really was when everything was on the line. But they were also stories that couldn't be told, not here, not to people who didn't have the clearance to know they'd happened. Sarah remained in her seat, keeping her memories to herself, and watched as the chaplain moved toward the closing benediction. But just as he was about to speak, a voice from the middle of the chapel interrupted. "I'd like to say something." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was a woman in army dress uniform, a captain with ranger tabs and a combat patch that Sarah didn't immediately recognize. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and the kind of bearing that suggested she'd earned her rank through performance rather than politics. The chaplain nodded, and the captain stood and walked to the front of the chapel. She turned to face the assembled mourners, her expression serious but controlled. "My name is Captain Martinez," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet space. "I didn't serve with Sergeant Patterson in his final unit, but I knew him from an earlier assignment." Sarah felt her attention sharpen. There was something in the captain's tone that suggested this wouldn't be a typical remembrance. "I can't talk about the specific circumstances of how I knew Sergeant Patterson," Martinez continued, "because those circumstances remain classified. But I can tell you that he saved lives. Not just once, but multiple times, in situations where saving lives required the kind of courage that most people can't imagine." The chapel was completely silent now, everyone focused on Martinez, and sensing that they were about to hear something important. Sergeant Patterson was the kind of soldier who volunteered for missions that other people were afraid to undertake, Martinez said. He was the kind of soldier who put the mission first, always, but never forgot that the mission was ultimately about bringing everyone home. Sarah's pulse quickened. Martinez was dancing close to the edge of what could be said in an open forum. But she was doing it skillfully, honoring Patterson's classified service without revealing operational details. "I want his family to know," Martinez continued, looking directly at Patterson's widow, "that their husband and father died as he lived, serving others, protecting the innocent, and upholding the values that make this country worth defending." Martinez paused, and Sarah could see her making a decision about how much more to say. "And I want everyone in this room to know that Sergeant Patterson's service extended far beyond what appears in his official record. There are missions that can't be acknowledged, operations that don't appear in history books, and soldiers whose greatest contributions to freedom remain classified long after they're gone." The captain's eyes swept the room, and for a moment, Sarah thought Martinez was looking directly at her. It was impossible to tell from this distance, but something in the captain's expression suggested recognition. Sergeant Danny Patterson was one of those soldiers, Martinez concluded. He served in the shadows so that others could live in the light. And while we can't talk about the details of that service, we can honor it by remembering that freedom isn't free, and that some of the people who pay its price are never properly thanked for their sacrifice. Martinez returned to her seat, and the chapel remained silent for several moments as people processed what they'd just heard. Sarah found herself studying the captain more carefully, noting the way she moved, the way she held herself, the particular alertness in her eyes that came from training and experience that went beyond conventional military service. The chaplain concluded the service with a prayer and the traditional military farewell, and slowly the mourners began to file out of the chapel. Sarah remained in her seat, watching as people gathered in small groups to offer condolences to Patterson's family and share additional memories with each other. She was about to leave when she noticed Captain Martinez approaching her row. The captain moved with the deliberate stride of someone who had something specific to accomplish, and when she reached Sarah's seat, she sat down without invitation. "Ma'am," Martinez said quietly, "I believe we need to talk." Sarah studied the captain's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the confidence in her bearing. "About what?" "About why we both felt the need to attend this service for a soldier who officially died during a routine patrol mission." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was assessing Martinez, trying to determine whether this was a conversation she wanted to have and what the potential consequences might be. "I saw you last night at Murphy's Tavern," Martinez continued. "I was having dinner at the restaurant across the street when I noticed Sergeant Major Torres enter the bar looking like he'd received urgent news. I was curious enough to follow him. And what did you see?" "I saw him show you the kind of respect that career NCOs don't usually show to civilians," Martinez said. "I also saw you handle some ignorant comments from junior enlisted soldiers with the kind of patience that comes from experience dealing with much more serious problems." Sarah remained silent, but Martinez continued anyway. "More importantly, I noticed that you positioned yourself at that table so you could observe both entrances to the bar, and that you kept your back to the wall throughout the entire conversation. That's not civilian behavior." "Maybe I'm just paranoid," Sarah said, echoing her comment from the previous evening. "Maybe," Martinez agreed. "Or maybe you're someone who's had to worry about threats that most people never think about." Sarah looked toward the front of the chapel, where Patterson's family was still receiving condolences from other mourners. "What's your point, Captain?" "My point is that I think you knew Danny Patterson in a capacity that's not reflected in his official personnel file. And I think you're here today for the same reason. I am to honor a soldier whose real service can't be publicly acknowledged." "And what capacity would that be?" Martinez leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice even further. "I think you both served in units that don't appear on organizational charts, carrying out missions that don't show up in after-action reports." Sarah turned to look at Martinez directly for the first time since the captain had sat down. "That's a very specific assumption to make about someone you don't know. It's an educated guess based on observable behavior and circumstantial evidence," Martinez replied. "The kind of analysis they teach in intelligence training." "Is that your background?" "Intelligence, among other things," Martinez said. "What about you?" Sarah stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I think I need to pay my respects to Sergeant Patterson's family." But Martinez stood as well, clearly not ready to let the subject drop. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to pry into classified information, but I am trying to understand why a woman who's obviously had specialized military training is being treated like a civilian by soldiers who should know better." "Maybe because that's what I am now," Sarah said. "Maybe," Martinez said. "Or maybe you're someone who's trying to honor a fallen comrade while maintaining operational security. About your shared service record." Sarah looked at Martinez for a long moment, weighing her options. The captain was clearly intelligent and observant, and she'd already demonstrated that she could piece together information from limited evidence. More importantly, she'd shown respect for operational security by speaking carefully about Patterson's classified service during her remarks. "Captain," Sarah said finally, "if I were the kind of person you think I am, what would you expect me to tell you?" "Nothing," Martinez replied immediately. "I'd expect you to deflect my questions and change the subject, which is exactly what you've been doing. And if I were just a civilian who'd served briefly in a conventional unit, then I expect you to either get angry at my implications or try to prove your military credentials by sharing war stories." Sarah nodded slightly. "So what does that tell you?" "It tells me that my assumptions are probably correct, and that you're someone who takes operational security seriously, even years after leaving the service." "And what do you plan to do with that information?" Martinez hesitated for a moment, and Sarah could see her making a decision about how much to reveal about her own motivations. "Ma'am, I'm going to share something with you that I probably shouldn't," Martinez said. "I'm currently assigned to a unit that's tasked with providing support services to veterans of classified operations. Part of my job involves identifying former special operations personnel who might need assistance transitioning to civilian life." Sarah felt her guard go up immediately. "What kind of assistance?" "Medical care, counseling, job placement, the kinds of services that conventional veterans get through normal channels." but adapted for people whose service records can't be fully disclosed. And why would you think I need that kind of assistance? Martinez gestured toward the chapel around them. Because you're attending the funeral of a soldier you officially never served with, in a place where you're being treated like an outsider by people who should recognize your service. Sarah considered this. The idea of specialized support services for classified veterans wasn't new, but it was something she'd never pursued. After leaving the Shadow Regiment, she'd been determined to handle her transition to civilian life independently, without drawing attention to her background or asking for help that might require explaining her service record. "Captain, I appreciate what you're trying to do," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm interested in assistance. That requires disclosing information I've spent years keeping private." "I understand," Martinez said, "but I'd like you to consider the possibility that there are people who can help you without requiring full disclosure. People who understand the unique challenges faced by veterans of operations that can't be acknowledged." Before Sarah could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of Sergeant Major Torres, who'd apparently been waiting for an opportunity to speak with her privately. "Ma'am," Torres said, nodding respectfully to both women, "I wanted to thank you for attending today's service. I know Sergeant Patterson would have appreciated your presence." "He was a good soldier," Sarah said simply. "Yes, he was," Torres agreed, "and Captain Martinez is right about the support services she mentioned. If you're interested, I can provide you with contact information for resources that specialize in helping veterans like yourself." Sarah looked between Torres and Martinez, noting the way they were both watching her with expressions that mixed respect with concern. It was clear that they'd discussed her situation, and that they were both convinced she was someone who needed help even if she wasn't ready to ask for it. "How long have you two been planning this intervention?" she asked. Torres looked slightly embarrassed. "Ma'am, it's not an intervention. It's just an offer of assistance from people who recognize that some veterans face challenges that others don't understand." "And what makes you think I'm facing challenges?" Martinez answered this time. "Because you're sitting in the back of a chapel attending the funeral of a soldier you allegedly never served with, in civilian clothes that help you blend in but also keep you separate from the military community you're obviously still connected to." She paused, studying Sarah's expression. "And because when those soldiers at Murphy's last night questioned whether you belonged there, you didn't defend yourself by mentioning your service record. Instead, you let them assume you were a civilian rather than risk revealing information you've been trained to protect." Sarah had to admit that Martinez's observations were uncomfortably accurate. She had been isolating herself from military communities while simultaneously being drawn to them, creating a situation where she was perpetually an outsider looking in. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah asked. "Just a conversation," Torres said, "with people who understand the unique situation faced by veterans of classified operations. No pressure, no requirements to disclose anything you're not comfortable sharing. And if I'm not interested, then we respect your decision and leave you alone," Martinez said. "But if you change your mind, the offer remains open." Sarah looked around the chapel, noting that most of the other mourners had left and that Patterson's family was preparing to depart as well. She felt the familiar weight of isolation, the sense of being surrounded by people who shared her values and experiences but could never fully understand her particular journey. "Where would this conversation take place?" she asked. "Wherever you're comfortable," Torres said. "Could be off base, could be informal. The important thing is that it would be with people who've been where you are." Sarah considered the offer for several moments, weighing the potential benefits against the risks of exposing herself to scrutiny. Finally, she made a decision that surprised even her. "There's a coffee shop downtown called The Grind," she said. "Tomorrow at 10:00 hours, but I reserve the right to leave if I don't like the direction the conversation takes." "Understood," Martinez said. "And ma'am?" Thank you for trusting us enough to consider this. Sarah nodded and walked toward the chapel entrance, leaving Torres and Martinez behind. As she stepped outside into the cool morning air, she found herself thinking about trust and isolation, about the price of keeping secrets and the cost of maintaining operational security long after the operations had ended. She was halfway to her car when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Corporal Jackson approaching with obvious hesitation. "Ma'am," he said, "I hope you don't mind me bothering you again, but I wanted to apologize for last night. Not just for Williams, but for all of us. We acted like jerks." Sarah studied the young soldier's face, noting the genuine remorse in his expression. "What changed your mind, Corporal?" "Murphy," Jackson said. "After you left, he told us some things about military service that we hadn't considered. About how the people who've done the most for their country are often the ones who talk about it least. Murphy's a wise man." "Yes, ma'am. He also said that if we ever see you again, we owe you a drink and an apology." Sarah smiled slightly. "The apology is sufficient, Corporal. But I appreciate the thought." Jackson nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? And please don't feel like you have to answer." "Go ahead." "Last night, when Williams was giving you grief about not looking military, you could have shut him down pretty easily. You could have told him about your service, shown him your ID, made him look foolish. But you didn't. Why?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Corporal, what do you think would have happened if I'd gotten into an argument with Private Williams about my military credentials? He probably would have backed down once he realized he was wrong." "Maybe," Sarah said. "Or maybe he would have doubled down and demanded proof, which would have created a scene that served nobody's interests." Jackson nodded slowly. "So, you chose to de-escalate instead of proving a point." "I chose to let him make his own mistakes rather than forcing him to confront them publicly," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "When you force someone to confront their mistakes publicly, they often become defensive and learn nothing. When you let them make their mistakes and face the consequences naturally, they have a chance to learn from the experience." Jackson considered this. "Is that why you didn't get angry when he was being disrespectful?" "I've been disrespected by much more dangerous people than Private Williams," Sarah said. "His opinion of me doesn't change who I am or what I've done. But it still must have bothered you." Sarah looked at Jackson for a moment, seeing something in his expression that reminded her of soldiers she'd served with. Good soldiers who asked the right questions and genuinely wanted to learn from their experiences. "Corporal," she said, "the day you stop being bothered by disrespect is the day you stop caring about the people you serve with. The trick is learning not to let being bothered affect your judgment or your behavior." Jackson nodded, and Sarah could see him processing this advice. "Ma'am, I know I'm probably overstepping, but Williams feels terrible about last night. He keeps talking about how he made assumptions based on appearances and how wrong he was." "Good," Sarah said. "That means he learned something." "Would you ever consider talking to him? Not to make him feel better, but to help him understand why what he did was wrong." Sarah thought about this request. Part of her was inclined to let Williams work through his guilt on his own, but another part recognized that young soldiers learned best when they had mentors willing to invest time in their development. "Tell Private Williams that if he wants to have a conversation about assumptions and respect, he can find me at the Grind Coffee Shop downtown tomorrow morning at 1100 hours, she said finally. Jackson looked surprised. "Really? Really? But make sure he understands that this isn't about making him feel better. It's about helping him become a better soldier." "I'll tell him," Jackson said. "And ma'am, thank you for giving him a chance to make it right." Sarah got in her car and drove away, thinking about second chances and teaching moments, about the responsibility that experienced soldiers had to mentor the next generation, even when that mentoring came at personal cost. She spent the rest of the day at her apartment, reading and trying not to think about the conversation she'd agreed to have the next morning. But as evening approached, she found herself pulling out her wallet and looking at the Shadow Regiment patch again, remembering the weight of responsibility it had represented and the bonds it had created with soldiers like Danny Patterson. Maybe Martinez and Torres were right. Maybe it was time to stop carrying that weight alone and start connecting with people who understood the particular challenges of serving in units that didn't exist and carrying out missions that couldn't be acknowledged. Maybe it was time to stop being an outsider and start being part of a community again, even if that community existed in the shadows where her service had taken place. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of autumn wind that cut through jacket fabric and reminded everyone that winter was coming. Sarah arrived at the grind 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the back where she could observe the entrance and have easy access to the rear exit. The coffee shop was busy with the morning rush, filled with civilians heading to work and a few off-duty soldiers grabbing caffeine before reporting for duty. She ordered black coffee and a scone she didn't really want, then settled in to wait. At exactly 10:00 hours, Captain Martinez entered, followed closely by Sergeant Major Torres and a third person. Sarah didn't recognize a civilian woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested extensive experience dealing with difficult situations. Martinez spotted Sarah immediately and led the small group to her table. They sat without ceremony, and Martinez handled the introductions. "Ma'am, this is Dr. Rachel Stone," Martinez said, indicating the civilian woman. "She's a psychologist who specializes in working with veterans of classified operations." Dr. Stone extended her hand, and Sarah shook it while studying the woman's face. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us," Stone said. "And I want you to know that nothing we discuss here will be recorded or reported to anyone without your explicit consent." "What exactly do you do, Dr. Stone?" Sarah asked. "I help veterans navigate the transition from classified military service to civilian life," Stone replied. "I work with people who can't fully explain their military experience to employers, family members, or even other veterans, and who often feel isolated as a result." Sarah sipped her coffee, considering this explanation. "And how do you help them?" "By providing a safe space to discuss the challenges they're facing without requiring them to reveal operational details," Stone said. "By connecting them with other veterans who've had similar experiences, and by helping them develop strategies for building meaningful relationships despite the limitations imposed by their service records." Torres leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, Dr. Stone has security clearances that allow her to work with veterans from various classified units. She understands the constraints you're operating under." "What kind of constraints do you think I'm operating under?" Sarah asked. Stone answered this question carefully. "Based on what Captain Martinez and Sergeant Major Torres have told me, I think you're someone who served in a capacity that required maintaining operational security long after your service ended. I think you've been trained to compartmentalize information and relationships in ways that can make civilian life challenging." Sarah didn't respond immediately, but Stone continued. "I also think you're someone who's probably very good at helping other people, but has difficulty accepting help for yourself. And I think you're here today because you're tired of carrying certain burdens alone, even if you're not ready to admit that." The accuracy of Stone's assessment was unsettling. Sarah had indeed become skilled at maintaining emotional distance from civilian relationships, partly out of habit and partly out of necessity. The training that had made her effective in classified operations had also made her somewhat dysfunctional in normal social situations. "Dr. Stone," Sarah said finally, "what would success look like in your work with someone like me?" "Success would look like you being able to maintain appropriate operational security while still building meaningful connections with people who understand your experience," Stone replied. "It would look like you feeling less isolated and more Supported, without compromising any of the principles that guided your military service. Sarah considered this, then looked at Martinez. Captain, what's your role in all this? I'm the liaison between Dr. Stone's program and active duty personnel who might benefit from her services, Martinez explained. I also help identify veterans like yourself who might be struggling with issues related to their classified service. And what made you think I was struggling? Martinez smiled slightly. Because you attended the funeral of a soldier you officially never served with, and you've been isolating yourself from military communities, while clearly still feeling connected to military values and traditions. That's not necessarily struggling, Sarah pointed out. No, Martinez agreed, but it's not thriving either. Before Sarah could respond, the coffee shop's front door opened and Private Williams entered, looking nervous and uncertain. He spotted Sarah's table immediately and approached with the careful stride of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. Ma'am, he said, stopping a few feet from the table. Corporal Jackson said you might be willing to talk to me. Sarah looked at the young soldier, noting the genuine anxiety in his expression and the effort he'd clearly put into his appearance. His civilian clothes were neat and pressed, and he'd obviously spent time preparing for this conversation. Sit down, Private, she said, indicating an empty chair. Williams sat carefully, glancing nervously at the other people at the table. Sarah made brief introductions, identifying Torres and Martinez by rank, but describing Dr. Stone simply as a counselor who worked with veterans. Private Williams, Sarah began. Corporal Jackson told me you wanted to apologize for your behavior the other night. Yes, ma'am, Williams said immediately. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and I was disrespectful and wrong. What assumptions did you make? Williams looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. I assumed you weren't military because you didn't look like what I thought a veteran should look like. I assumed you didn't belong at Murphy's because you weren't wearing anything that identified you as part of the military community. And why were those assumptions wrong? Because they were based on superficial observations rather than actual knowledge, Williams said. And because I let my own insecurities about belonging somewhere make me question other people's right to be there. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's a good analysis, Private. What else? Williams thought for a moment. I was also wrong because I assumed that military service always looks the same, that all veterans present themselves the same way. I didn't consider that some people might have reasons for not advertising their military background, such as wanting privacy or having served in capacities that they can't talk about, or just wanting to be seen as individuals rather than being defined by their military service. Sarah looked at Dr. Stone, who was listening to the conversation with obvious interest. Private Williams, what have you learned from this experience? I've learned that respect isn't something you withhold until someone proves they deserve it, Williams said. It's something you give until someone proves they don't deserve it. Good, Sarah said. What else? I've learned that the people who've done the most often talk about it least, Williams continued. And that making assumptions about people based on their appearance or behavior is almost always a mistake. Torres spoke for the first time since Williams had arrived. Private, what are you going to do differently in the future? I'm going to listen more and assume less, Williams said. I'm going to treat everyone with respect regardless of whether I think they belong somewhere. And I'm going to remember that my job as a soldier is to protect and serve others, not to police who belongs in military spaces. Sarah studied Williams' face, noting the sincerity in his expression and the evidence that he genuinely reflected on his behavior. Private, I accept your apology. And I appreciate that you've taken the time to think about why what you did was wrong. Williams looked relieved. Thank you, ma'am. Is there anything I can do to make up for how I acted? Yes, Sarah said. You can remember this conversation the next time you encounter someone who doesn't fit your expectations of what a veteran should look like. And you can treat them with the respect that all people deserve, regardless of whether you understand their story. I will, ma'am. Sarah looked around the table at the assembled group: Torres with his career military bearing, Martinez with her intelligence and compassion, Dr. Stone with her quiet understanding, and Williams with his youth and willingness to learn from his mistakes. "You know," she said finally, "I came here this morning thinking I was going to have a conversation about whether I needed help adjusting to civilian life. But I think what I really needed was a reminder that being part of a community doesn't require revealing everything about yourself." Dr. Stone leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been so focused on protecting my operational security that I forgot that trust isn't an all-or-nothing proposition," Sarah explained. "I can be part of a military community without disclosing classified information. I can build relationships with people who understand my experience without revealing operational details." She looked at Williams. "And I can help young soldiers learn important lessons without compromising any of the principles that guided my service." Martinez smiled. "So you're interested in staying connected to the military community?" "I'm interested in finding ways to serve that don't require me to reveal information I've spent years protecting," Sarah said. "Maybe that means mentoring young soldiers. Maybe it means supporting other veterans who faced similar challenges." "I'm not sure yet." Torres nodded approvingly. "Ma'am, there are always opportunities for experienced veterans to contribute to the development of the next generation, formal and informal. And there are support networks for veterans of classified operations," Dr. Stone added. "People who understand the unique challenges you faced and who can provide assistance without requiring full disclosure." Sarah finished her coffee and looked around the table again. "Dr. Stone, I'd like to continue our conversation. Not because I think I need fixing, but because I think I need community." "I'd be honored to work with you," Stone replied. Sarah stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. But before she left, she looked at Williams one more time. "Private, you asked if there was anything you could do to make up for your behavior the other night." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small object, placing it on the table in front of Williams. It was a coin, military style, with symbols that most people wouldn't recognize. "This is a challenge coin from a unit that doesn't exist anymore," she said. "I'm giving it to you not because you've earned it, but because I want you to remember this conversation every time you see it." Williams picked up the coin carefully, studying the unfamiliar symbols. "What do the symbols mean?" "They mean that service comes in many forms, and that the most important service is often the kind that goes unrecognized," Sarah said. "They mean that respect is earned through actions, not appearances. And they mean that the best soldiers are the ones who learn from their mistakes and use those lessons to become better leaders." Williams looked up at her with obvious emotion. "Ma'am, I don't deserve this." "No," Sarah agreed, "you don't. But maybe someday you will. And when that day comes, you'll understand why I gave it to you." Sarah left the coffee shop feeling lighter than she had in months. Not because she'd shared classified information or revealed operational secrets, but because she'd remembered that community and operational security weren't mutually exclusive. She could honor her training and her oath while still being part of something larger than herself. As she walked to her car, she thought about Danny Patterson and the memorial service that had brought all these people together. He would have approved of what had happened this morning, she thought. He would have understood that the best way to honor fallen soldiers was to help living soldiers become better people. And maybe that was the real lesson here, that service didn't end when you took off the uniform, and that the skills learned in classified operations could be used to build communities and mentor the next generation without compromising the security that had made those operations possible. Sarah drove home thinking about challenge coins and second chances, about the responsibility that experienced soldiers had to share their knowledge even when they couldn't share their stories. She thought about Dr. Stone's offer of support and Torres' suggestion that there were opportunities to serve in new ways. Most of all, she thought about the Shadow Regiment patch in her wallet and what it had meant to wear it. It had represented excellence, sacrifice, and service to something larger than herself. Those values didn't disappear when the unit was disbanded or when she transitioned to civilian life. They just found new expressions, new ways to make a difference in the world. Maybe it was time to stop hiding in the shadows and start using her experience to cast light for others who were still finding their way. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in front of the Advanced Leadership Development Center at Fort Braxton, holding a visitor's badge that felt heavier than it should have. The building was modern glass and steel, designed to project an image of forward-thinking military education. But Sarah knew that the real learning happened in smaller rooms where experienced leaders shared hard-won wisdom with the next generation. She'd agreed to speak to a class of senior NCOs about leadership under pressure, though the invitation had come through unofficial channels. Sergeant Major Torres had mentioned her availability to the course director, who'd made the request without asking too many questions about her background. The topic was deliberately vague decision-making, ambiguous situations, which allowed her to share insights without revealing classified operations. The walk through the building's corridors brought back memories of other military facilities, other briefing rooms where she'd received orders that couldn't be written down and discussed, missions that wouldn't appear in official records. But this felt different. This was about building up rather than tearing down, about sharing knowledge rather than gathering it. The classroom held 24 students, all of them senior enlisted leaders with multiple deployments and years of experience, managing soldiers in difficult circumstances. They were the backbone of the Army, the men and women who turned officers' intent into action and who bore the responsibility for bringing everyone home safely. Sarah had chosen to wear civilian clothes again, though she'd upgraded from her usual casual attire to business professional. Dark slacks, a navy blazer, and minimal jewelry that wouldn't distract from her message. She wanted to be seen as a professional educator rather than a former operator, though she suspected that distinction would prove meaningless once the conversation began. The course director, a lieutenant colonel named Peterson, introduced her, with carefully chosen words that revealed nothing while implying everything. This is Ms. Chen, who brings extensive experience in small unit operations and crisis decision-making to our discussion today. Sarah took her position at the front of the classroom, studying the faces before her. These were serious people who'd earned their positions through performance under pressure, and they deserved respect and honesty within the boundaries of what she could share. "Good morning," she began. "I'm here to talk with you about making decisions when you don't have enough information, when the stakes are high, and when failure isn't an option." A master sergeant in the front row raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's your background in small unit operations?" Sarah had expected this question and had prepared her response carefully. "I spent 8 years in various Army units, including some that required rapid decision-making in high-stress environments. I can't discuss specific operations, but I can share principles and approaches that proved effective." The master sergeant nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. Sarah could see in his expression that he understood the implications of what she wasn't saying and that he was prepared to listen to what she could share. "The first principle," Sarah continued, "is that perfect information is a luxury you rarely have in the field. You make decisions based on what you know, what you can reasonably assume, and what risks you're willing to accept." She moved to the whiteboard and wrote 3 words: known, assumed, acceptable. Every decision you make in a crisis situation involves weighing these 3 factors, she explained. What do you know for certain? What are you willing to assume, based on experience and context? And what level of risk is acceptable given the potential consequences of action versus inaction? A staff sergeant in the middle of the room spoke up. "Ma'am, How do you train people to make good assumptions when they don't have experience in the specific situation they're facing? Excellent question, Sarah replied. You train them to recognize patterns and to trust their instincts while remaining flexible enough to adjust when new information becomes available. She turned back to the whiteboard and added another word: adaptability. The worst decisions are often made by leaders who stick to their initial assessment, even when evidence suggests they were wrong, Sarah said. Pride becomes more important than mission success, and people die because someone can't admit they made a mistake. The room was quiet, and Sarah could sense that she had their full attention. These were people who understood the weight of leadership decisions, who'd felt the responsibility of lives hanging in the balance. Let me give you a hypothetical scenario, Sarah continued. You're leading a patrol in hostile territory when you receive intelligence about a potential threat to a nearby friendly unit. The intelligence is incomplete. You don't know the size of the threat, the exact timing, or whether the information is reliable. She paused, looking around the room. What factors do you consider in deciding whether to act on this intelligence? Hands went up around the room, and Sarah spent the next 20 minutes facilitating a discussion that revealed the depth of experience and wisdom in the classroom. These senior NCOs understood the complexity of battlefield decision-making, and they shared insights that came from years of practical experience. As the discussion continued, Sarah found herself relaxing into the role of facilitator rather than lecturer. These weren't students who needed to be taught basic concepts. They were experienced professionals who benefited from the opportunity to examine their own decision-making processes and learn from each other's experiences. Ma'am, a sergeant, first class near the back of the room, said during a brief pause, you mentioned trusting instincts. How do you develop that kind of intuition? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one that touched on training and experience that she couldn't fully describe, but the principle was universal enough to share. Intuition isn't magic, she said. It's pattern recognition based on accumulated experience. You develop it by paying attention to details that others miss, by debriefing every operation to identify what worked and what didn't, and by being honest about your mistakes. She moved away from the whiteboard and leaned against the desk at the front of the room, adopting a more conversational posture. The best leaders I've worked with were the ones who could process multiple streams of information simultaneously and identify the factors that really mattered, she continued. They weren't necessarily the smartest people in the room, but they were the ones who'd trained themselves to see connections that others missed. How do you train that skill? The sergeant first class asked. Practice, Sarah said simply. You put yourself in situations where you have to make decisions quickly, and you pay attention to the outcomes. You study other people's decision-making processes, and you develop the discipline to question your own assumptions before you act on them. The discussion continued for another hour, covering topics from risk assessment to communication under pressure to the psychology of decision-making in high-stress environments. Sarah found herself sharing more than she'd planned, though she was careful to frame everything in terms of principles rather than specific examples. As the session wound down, Lieutenant Colonel Peterson stood to offer closing remarks. Ms. Chen has given you a lot to think about, he said. I encourage you to continue this discussion with your subordinates and peers. The principles we've talked about today apply at every level of leadership. After the students filed out, Peterson approached Sarah with obvious curiosity. That was excellent, he said. Where did you develop your expertise in crisis decision-making? Sarah gathered her notes, choosing her words carefully. Various assignments over the years. Different environments, different challenges. Peterson nodded, clearly understanding that she wasn't going to provide specifics. Would you be interested in doing this again? We have other courses that could benefit from your perspective. Possibly, Sarah said. I'd need to see the specific topics and format. Of course. I'll have my staff put together some options and send them to you through Sergeant Major Torres. As Sarah left the building, she reflected on how different this experience had been from her morning at Murphy's Tavern just weeks earlier. Here, she'd been treated as a professional educator, sharing valuable expertise. Her knowledge had been respected and her experience valued, even though the students knew almost nothing about her background. The difference, she realized, wasn't in the setting or the audience. It was in her own approach. When she'd positioned herself as someone with something valuable to offer, rather than someone trying to blend in and avoid attention, people had responded accordingly. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Stone. "Coffee this afternoon? I have some interesting opportunities to discuss." Sarah replied that she was available and suggested they meet at a different coffee shop, one closer to downtown, that would provide more privacy for their conversation. The afternoon meeting took place at a small independent coffee shop called the Bean Counter, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where they were unlikely to encounter anyone from Fort Braxton. Dr. Stone was already there when Sarah arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder. "How did the presentation go?" Stone asked as Sarah sat down. "Better than expected," Sarah replied. "It felt good to share knowledge in a constructive way." Stone smiled. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been thinking about our conversation from 2 weeks ago, and I have some ideas about how you might continue serving in ways that utilize your experience without compromising your operational security." She opened the manila folder and pulled out several documents. There are organizations that provide specialized training to military and law enforcement personnel, organizations that value expertise over credentials and that understand the need for discretion about backgrounds. Sarah examined the documents, which described various consulting and training opportunities with private companies that contracted with government agencies. The position descriptions were deliberately vague, but they clearly required the kind of experience and skills that came from classified operations. "What would be required in terms of background disclosure?" Sarah asked. "Minimal," Stone replied. "These organizations work with former special operations personnel regularly. They understand that detailed service records may not be available or discussable. What matters is demonstrated competence and the ability to communicate effectively." Sarah continued reading, noting that several of the opportunities involve developing training, curricula for leadership development, and crisis management. Others focused on consulting with organizations that needed to improve their decision-making processes under pressure. "This is interesting," Sarah said, "but I'm not sure I want to make a career out of my military experience. I've been trying to move beyond that chapter of my life." Stone leaned forward. "Sarah, can I ask you something? When you were teaching that class this morning, how did it feel?" Sarah considered the question. "It felt useful, like I was contributing something valuable." "And when you mentored Private Williams at the coffee shop?" "Similar, like I was helping someone learn something important." Stone nodded. "Those feelings are telling you something. You don't have to make a career out of your military experience, but you also don't have to wall it off completely. There are ways to honor that experience while building something new." Sarah looked at the documents again, this time focusing on opportunities that involved occasional teaching or consulting rather than full-time employment. Several organizations were looking for subject matter experts who could contribute on a project basis, sharing knowledge without becoming permanently identified with their military backgrounds. "What about the other veterans you work with?" Sarah asked. "How do they handle the balance between honoring their service and moving forward?" "It varies," Stone said. "Some choose to stay closely connected to military communities. Others prefer to apply their skills in completely civilian contexts. The key is finding an approach that feels authentic to your values and goals." She pulled another document from the folder. "There's something else I wanted to discuss." a support group for veterans of classified operations. It meets monthly, very informal, just an opportunity for people with similar experiences to connect and share challenges. Sarah read the brief description, noting that the group focused on practical issues like career transitions, relationship challenges, and identity questions that arose when your most significant accomplishments couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "How many people typically attend?" Sarah asked. 8 to 12. Men and women, different branches of service, different specialties. What they have in common is experience in operations that don't appear on their official records. Sarah thought about the isolation she'd felt over the past few years, the sense of being disconnected from both military and civilian communities. The idea of talking with people who understood the unique challenges of classified service was appealing, though it also felt risky. What's discussed in these meetings? Practical stuff mostly. How to handle job interviews when you can't fully explain your background. How to maintain relationships when you can't share important parts of your life. How to find purpose and meaning after leaving work that you found deeply fulfilling but can't talk about. Stone paused, studying Sarah's expression. Also grief, sometimes. For units that were disbanded, for missions that didn't end well, for identities that had to be left behind. The word grief hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. She hadn't thought about her transition from the Shadow Regiment in those terms, but there was truth in it. She had lost something when that chapter of her life ended, not just a job, but a sense of purpose and belonging that she'd struggled to replace. "When is the next meeting?" Sarah asked. "Next Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. I can give you the location if you're interested." Sarah nodded, and Stone wrote an address on a piece of paper. "No pressure," Stone added. "Come if it feels right. Skip it if it doesn't. The invitation remains open." They talked for another 30 minutes about practical strategies for maintaining emotional health while protecting operational security. Stone shared insights from her work with other veterans, and Sarah found herself opening up about some of the challenges she'd faced in civilian life. As they prepared to leave, Stone made one final observation. "Sarah, you've spent years learning how to compartmentalize information and relationships for security purposes. But compartmentalization can become a habit that persists even when it's no longer necessary. Part of your journey may involve learning when it's safe to be more open and when security concerns are still valid." Sarah drove home thinking about compartmentalization and community, about the difference between necessary security measures and unnecessary isolation. Stone was right that some of her habits from classified service had outlived their usefulness. But she also knew that some secrets needed to remain secrets regardless of their age. The challenge was learning to distinguish between the two, to maintain appropriate operational security while still allowing herself to build meaningful connections with people who could understand at least part of her experience. That evening, Sarah called Captain Martinez to thank her for facilitating the morning's teaching opportunity and to ask about other ways she might contribute to military education without revealing classified information. "I've been thinking about that," Martinez said. "There are leadership development programs that need subject matter experts who can teach decision-making under pressure. Also mentorship programs for junior officers and NCOs who are preparing for specialized assignments. What would that involvement look like? Occasional guest lectures, maybe some one-on-one mentoring. Nothing that would require you to disclose operational details, but opportunities to share leadership principles and decision-making frameworks." Sarah found herself genuinely interested in these possibilities. The morning's teaching experience had reminded her how much she valued the opportunity to share knowledge and help others develop their capabilities. "Can you send me information about specific opportunities?" Sarah asked. "Absolutely. I'll put together a packet and email it to you." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea, thinking about the trajectory of the past few weeks. She'd gone from feeling like an outsider in military spaces to being invited to teach in military classrooms. The change hadn't required her to reveal classified information or compromise her operational security. It had simply required her to reframe how she thought about her experience and her role in the community. Maybe the real lesson was that belonging wasn't about having the right credentials or fitting into expected categories. Maybe it was about contributing value and treating others with respect, regardless of whether you could fully explain your background or qualifications. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began drafting an email to Dr. Stone, expressing her interest in attending the next support group meeting. As she wrote, she found herself thinking about Danny Patterson and what he would have thought about her recent decisions to become more engaged with military communities. He would have approved, she decided. He'd been the kind of soldier who believed that knowledge and experience were meant to be shared, that the purpose of developing expertise was to help others succeed. He'd also understood the importance of operational security, but he'd never let security concerns prevent him from mentoring younger soldiers or contributing to mission success. The next Thursday evening, Sarah found herself driving to an address in a residential neighborhood about 15 minutes from Fort Braxton. The house was modest and unremarkable, the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business and visitors didn't attract attention. Dr. Stone met her at the door and led her to a living room where 9 other people were gathered in a loose circle of chairs. They ranged in age from early 30s to late 50s, and while they were all in civilian clothes, there was something in their bearing that marked them as military even without uniforms. "Everyone," Stone said, "this is Sarah. She's considering joining our group." The introductions were brief and used first names only. No ranks, no unit affiliations, no detailed service histories. Just names and a general acknowledgement that everyone present had served in capacities that remained classified. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced since leaving the military. These people understood the challenges of transitioning from classified work to civilian life, the difficulty of building relationships when you couldn't fully explain your background, the sense of loss that came from leaving work that had provided deep meaning and purpose. "I've been out for 3 years," said a woman named Jennifer who appeared to be in her early 40s, "and I still catch myself being hyper-vigilant in crowds. My husband thinks I'm paranoid, but I can't turn off the habit of scanning for threats." Several people nodded in recognition. A man named Robert shared his struggle with finding civilian work that felt meaningful after years of high-stakes operations. "Everything seems trivial compared to what we used to do," he said. "I know that's not fair to civilian employers, but it's hard to get excited about quarterly sales targets when you've been responsible for life-and-death decisions." Sarah listened to story after story that echoed her own experience, feeling a sense of relief at finally being around people who understood the particular challenges of her transition. When Dr. Stone invited her to share something about her own experience, she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. "I've been struggling with isolation," Sarah said. "I've been trying so hard to protect operational security that I've cut myself off from both military and civilian communities. I'm finally learning that there's a difference between appropriate discretion and unnecessary isolation." The group discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics from career transitions to relationship challenges to strategies for maintaining emotional health. What struck Sarah most was the absence of judgment or competition. These people weren't trying to impress each other with war stories or establish pecking orders based on their service records. They were simply supporting each other through the unique challenges they all faced. As the meeting wound down, Jennifer approached Sarah with a business card. "I run a consulting firm that specializes in crisis management and leadership development," she explained. "We're always looking for people with relevant experience who can contribute to our training programs. The work is project-based, so you can control your level of involvement." Sarah accepted the card, noting that the company name was deliberately generic, and that Jennifer's title was listed simply as Principal Consultant. "What kind of training do you provide?" Sarah asked. "Leadership under pressure, decision-making in ambiguous situations, team cohesion in high-stress environments. We work with corporations, government agencies, and sometimes military units. That needs specialized training." It sounded like exactly the kind of opportunity that Dr. Stone had mentioned. Work that would allow Sarah to share her expertise without compromising her operational security. "I'd be interested in learning more," Sarah said. "I'll email you some information," Jennifer replied. "Take your time looking it over and let me know if you have questions." As Sarah drove home, she reflected on how much her perspective had changed over the past few weeks. She'd started by attending a memorial service for a fallen comrade, feeling isolated and disconnected from military communities. Now she was actively engaging with opportunities to teach, mentor, and support other veterans while maintaining appropriate boundaries around classified information. The key had been learning to reframe her experience as a resource rather than a burden, as something that could benefit others rather than something that needed to be hidden. She still couldn't talk about specific operations or reveal details about the Shadow Regiment, but she could share principles and approaches that had proven effective in high-pressure situations. More importantly, she'd learned that community and operational security weren't mutually exclusive. She could maintain appropriate discretion about her background while still building meaningful connections with people who understood her experience. Sarah spent the weekend reviewing the materials that Jennifer had sent, which described training programs that covered exactly the kind of topics she'd addressed in her presentation to the senior NCO class. The work was challenging and meaningful, allowing her to contribute to the development of current and future leaders without requiring her to reveal classified information. On Monday morning, she called Jennifer to express her interest in contributing to the training programs. By Wednesday, she had her first consulting assignment, developing a curriculum on decision-making under pressure for a corporate client whose executives needed to improve their crisis management capabilities. The work felt like a natural extension of her military experience, applying lessons learned in classified operations to help others develop their leadership capabilities. She was using her expertise in service of others, just as she had during her time in the Shadow Regiment, but in a context that allowed her to be more open about her role and contributions. 3 months later, Sarah found herself back at Murphy's Tavern, but this time she wasn't alone. She was there with Jennifer and 2 other veterans from the support group, celebrating the successful completion of a training program they'd developed for a military unit, preparing for deployment. The tavern looked exactly the same, but Sarah's relationship to the space had changed completely. She was no longer an outsider trying to blend in. She was part of a community that valued her contributions and respected her need for discretion about her background. As they sat around a table sharing stories and planning their next project, Sarah noticed Private Williams enter with Corporal Jackson and several other soldiers. Williams spotted her immediately and approached their table with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to thank you again for the advice you gave me. I've been carrying that challenge coin you gave me, and it's helped me remember to treat everyone with respect." Sarah smiled. "How are you doing, Private Williams?" "Good, ma'am. Really good. I've been trying to apply what you taught me about assumptions and respect, and it's made me a better soldier." Williams hesitated, then continued. "Ma'am, I was wondering if you might be willing to talk to some of the other soldiers in my unit. We've had some incidents where people made assumptions about others, and I think your perspective could help." Sarah looked at Jennifer and the other veterans at her table, then back at Williams. "I think that could be arranged, Private. Talk to Sergeant Major Torres about setting something up." Williams thanked her and returned to his friends who were clearly curious about the interaction. Sarah watched him explain something to them, noting the respectful way he spoke about her and the serious attention they paid to his words. "You've made quite an impression on that young soldier," Jennifer observed. "He made an impression on me too," Sarah replied. "He was willing to admit he was wrong and learn from his mistakes. That takes courage." As the evening continued, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She'd learned to balance operational security with community engagement, to share her expertise without compromising classified information, and to build meaningful relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Most importantly, she'd learned that service didn't end when you took off the uniform. The skills and experience she'd gained during her time in the Shadow Regiment could continue to serve others in new contexts, helping to develop the next generation of leaders and supporting fellow veterans who faced similar challenges. The patch in her wallet still represented sacrifice and service to something larger than herself. But now it also represented the foundation for a new kind of service, one that honored her past while building toward a future where her experience could benefit others, without compromising the principles that had guided her throughout her military career. Sarah raised her glass in a quiet toast to Danny, Patterson, and the other members of the Shadow Regiment who hadn't made it home. They would be proud, she thought, to see their shared experience being used to help others succeed and to build the kind of community that honored service while respecting the need for discretion. As she looked around the table at her new colleagues and across the room at the young soldiers she was helping to mentor, Sarah realized that she'd finally found her place in the world again. Not as a shadow operating in secret, but as a leader and teacher whose greatest accomplishments might be the success of the people she helped along the way. The shadows hadn't disappeared. They still protected information that needed protection and maintained security that remained necessary. But they no longer defined her entire existence. Now they were simply one part of a larger picture that included community, purpose, and the satisfaction of serving others in ways that honored both her past and her future. Sarah finished her drink and prepared to head home, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to teach, mentor, and contribute to the development of leaders who would face their own challenges in an uncertain world. She couldn't give them all the answers, but she could share the principles and approaches that had served her well during her own journey from the shadows into the light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.